Distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the 11th Annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. My name is Hillel Neuer. I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch. I want to begin today by thanking all of our 25 human rights non-governmental organizations from around the world that have joined with us today to co-sponsor this event. A few months ago, on December 10th, the world marked the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This landmark document, which is hailed as a beacon every year by human rights activists struggling for their basic freedoms, was made possible by the work between 1946 and 1948 of illustrious idealists and humanitarians. They include the founding chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, her vice chair, René Cassin, Charles Malik from Lebanon, P.C. Chang from China, John Humphrey from Canada, someone whom I knew a little bit when I was studying law at McGill University in Montreal. These were the idealistic founders of human rights at the United Nations. Today, we meet only a few days after the conclusion of the main annual session of today's United Nations Human Rights Council. And although it ended by adopting a handful of resolutions on countries that require the world's attention, the vast majority of the world's worst abusers of human rights received immunity. They received impunity. Even worse, many of these non-democratic, authoritarian, oppressive regimes actually sit as members on this 47-nation body. It includes countries like China, Cuba, Pakistan, Qatar, Eritrea, Philippines, and the list goes on and on. And so when human rights activists sit there at this council, we have good reason to be depressed, to be pessimistic, and to wonder what is the future of human rights today. And we'll hear in a moment from our opening address some thoughts about where we stand today in the world on human rights. But when I arrive here this morning, and for the past couple of days as we've been receiving our human rights heroes, families of political prisoners, you have reason, we all have reason today, to be inspired. So while it's true that at the Human Rights Council for the past 6 years, we had Venezuela sitting as a member of the Human Rights Council, even as they beat their people, even as millions have fled. Today we're going to hear very soon from Ambassador Diego Aria, the former Venezuelan ambassador, the former president of the Security Council. We're going to hear the real voice of Venezuela, and that gives me hope. And we're going to hear, although Cuba, a country that throws journalists in prison and human rights activists, sits on the Human Rights Council, we're going to hear from Juan Carlos Gutierrez, a human rights lawyer who's representing Dr. Eduardo Carde, the leader of the Christian Liberation Movement, an inspiring figure, and we're going to hear about the true Cuban champions of human rights, and that gives me hope. And although Nicaragua today sits in New York on the 19-nation committee that oversees the work of human rights NGOs, very soon we're going to hear from Felix Maradiaga, one of the leading human rights figures in Nicaragua, someone who has paid the price for standing up for democracy in a country that for the past year has been beating students and protesters and journalists, and thousands are fleeing. And although Saudi Arabia seems here in Geneva to be a permanent member of the Human Rights Council, that's not actually in the rules, but every single time there's an election, they get reelected. And every time there's an election for a women's rights commission, they're on every single UN women's rights agency you can imagine. Well, we're going to hear from Ensaf Haidar, wife of perhaps the world's most famous political prisoner, Raif Badawi, the Saudi human rights hero blogger who called for a free society and was thrown in prison years ago. And we're going to hear from Ensaf, his wife, and from his 3 children for the first time coming here. They were at the United Nations yesterday for our opening event. Najwa and Tirad and Miriam. We're going to hear from Raif's wife and children. And we'll have reason to be inspired. And although Burundi was sitting here as a member on the Human Rights Council for the past 3 years, even though their dictator, who was recently named the Eternal Supreme Guide, even though he pursues a policy of extrajudicial assassinations and arbitrary detentions, and even though they just arrested a few schoolgirls for the crime of doodling in their book on a picture of the president, well, we're going to hear soon from Kedi Nivyabandi, an inspiring Burundian poet and democracy activist, and she popularized last week to help these girls a hashtag called Free Our Girls, school children who were arrested for drawing in a school book on the president. And that hashtag has gone viral. You can all, those of you on social media, can promote the hashtag Free Our Girls. And although Turkey sits as vice president of the committee that oversees human rights NGOs in New York, we're going to hear from Nurcan Baysal, award-winning Kurdish journalist recently detained by Turkey. We're going to hear exactly what is happening in a part of Turkey that the world doesn't know about, and many diplomats fear to even go there to find out. And although in New York at the United Nations, Syria sits as rapporteur of the UN Committee on Decolonization, whose objective is to end the subjugation of peoples, even as Syria has killed perhaps 500,000 of its own people. We're going to hear from Abdulaziz al-Hamza, someone who was arrested by the Assad regime, by ISIS, and is the co-founder of Raqqa, is being slaughtered silently. We're going to hear from a real Syrian human rights voice, someone who really is fighting the subjugation of peoples. And although too many countries at the UN are practicing today female genital mutilation, and it's an issue that is never addressed in any meaningful way, we're going to hear from Nimco Ali, the legendary campaigner against female genital mutilation. And although China sits as a member of the Human Rights Council, and last week when I tried to speak out for Muslims, 1 million Muslims today being detained in so-called re-education camps, and China was furiously banging on the table to silence me, and the chair warned me initially, said, I warn you, you have to stick to the agenda item, implying that I wasn't when I was speaking under the issue of discrimination for 1 million Muslims. Well, we're going to hear from Dr. Yang Jianli, former political prisoner, the president of Initiatives for China, and a survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre, someone who's spoken out for all regions and peoples in China. And although Vietnam was a member here of the Human Rights Council, we're going to hear from Nguyen Van Dai, a human rights lawyer who was thrown into prison numerous times. He was just released from prison, and he's come here to share with you what's happening in Vietnam. And although the Philippines was just elected to the Human Rights Council, even though we urged the UN not to elect the Philippines, that President Duterte is waging a so-called drug war where he is proud of killing people just like that, we're going to hear from Vicente de Lima II, whose sister, Senator Laila de Lima, who dared to speak out against Duterte, was thrown into prison. She's a political prisoner, and we'll hear the truth about what's happening there. And although Iran was just elected to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, to their committee that judges women's rights violations around the world. If you make a complaint about women's rights violations, Iran is now sitting on the committee that's going to judge that, and Iran speaks here on human rights. We're going to hear from Richard Ratcliffe, whose wife, Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, is a political prisoner today in Iran. And although Yemen was also recently elected as vice president of one of the UN's Women's Rights Commissions, we're going to hear from Dr. Elham Mani, who's originally from Yemen, a professor from the University of Zurich, who's outspoken for women's rights in the Middle East. We're going to hear the truth about that. And finally, we're going to hear about Tibet, a word that you can't even mention at the United Nations, or you risk being ejected from there. We're going to hear from Dondup Wangchen, the courageous Tibetan human rights activist who made a documentary film about what was happening in Tibet. They threw him in prison, they tortured him. He finally escaped and is free, and he's come here for the first time to address our Geneva summit. So ladies and gentlemen, if we had reason to be depressed, today you have reason to be inspired. We have assembled here today the moral force, some of the most courageous men and women around the world, and our pledge to them is to listen to their words, to do everything we can to help them, to pressure our own governments, and there's people watching around the world, webcast on genevasummit.org, and our hashtag is hashtag GS19. Spread their words, tell your governments that we need to take action, and indeed tell your governments that we need a United Nations that looks exactly like the kinds of people you're going to see today. The real moral force, the real human rights voices that we need to see at the United Nations. I have the honor now to introduce our opening speaker, someone who's I would say, a rare writer. Most people today, when you read the newspaper and you read a columnist, you know exactly what he or she is going to say on the issue that you care about. Well, James Kirchick is someone different. When you read him, you're not sure what he's going to say because he is thinking about the issue and giving you his true thoughts, original thoughts on the issue. He's giving you the truth. He's a visiting fellow at the Center on the U.S. and Europe and the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He's a widely published journalist, author of, quote, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. He's a columnist for Tablet Magazine, a frequent contributor to a wide array of publications, including the LA Times, Washington Post, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Politico, Foreign Policy, and many others. He works on European politics, grand strategy. He began his journalism career with the New Republic. He lived in Prague and worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He is a leading voice on international gay rights. He is a recipient of the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association Journalist of the Year Award. He has been a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow in Berlin, a Hoover Institution Media Fellow, a Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellow, and a professional member of the PEN American Center, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's spoken at many human rights assemblies such as this, including the Oslo Freedom Forum, the Stockholm Free World Forum. He's appeared here before at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. It is my honor and privilege, a real treat for us all, to introduce our opening speaker, James Kirchick.